Hey, good morning. It is Tuesday, right? June
It is
11th.
Tuesday.
Yeah, Tuesday, June 11th. We are getting close to the midpoint of 2024, which is just astounding to me. Um, Here on the Dev Talk Show, Rich Ross is joining me,
Morning, Chris.
and we are getting ready to dive back into .NET Aspire, right?
Yes. Yeah. Maybe clean some things up. Maybe put some closure around some of this, at least for where we are now. So that'd be fun.
Yeah, absolutely. So, this is part 3 of the series, and one of the things we're looking at here is we're trying to just understand uh, part of the process of bringing .NET Aspire to an existing app, which of course means you need an existing app.
Mm-hmm.
And in our case, we have the Hello DallE sample that Rich has shown on this show, which is pretty cool. Asks you, um, I guess the best way to put it is like for some themes about what your generated art might be or what you might want for it. Is it abstract? Is it about nature? I don't know. And the best part about it, what I love about it, is the category. I don't even know what the categories will be because those are generated too, which I love. So
Yeah. I mean, right now it's it's in that state of we're trying to get it to work with Aspire, and I think when we go through a few things that I was able to play around with over the weekend, that we can kind of show what it looks like and show the app again and talk through it a little bit.
right, awesome, yeah.
Yeah.
So certainly have had a lot of thoughts about Aspire, although I'm still learning. So we'll talk about those as we're chatting here, because it's the kind of thing that I think has the potential to be really valuable in certain use cases that I spot right away. And
Mm-hmm.
what I hope that's helping you as well as us is maybe spot the other use cases that aren't so obvious. Um, so
Yes. Cool. So yeah, I'm doing something to get us set here. All right. That should work. Hopefully. There we go. Next. I am assigning some permissions and I'm doing those off camera because one of
okay,
the things we might take a look at is key vault, and you kind of need to have access to certain things to do that. So
yeah,
we'll put that
right.
aside. Let's do this. Let's present screen. Here.
It's working on it. It's thinking about it. There we go.
Nice.
Awesome. Yeah. So if you
One of
don't know about .NET Aspire, gosh, what's the best way? What's the best way to categorize .NET Aspire? I know part of the sales pitch was that it is difficult to develop what I guess you could call a distributed app, because
Mhm.
an app with even more than one part, I think, becomes complicated.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
yeah, I've witnessed this myself many times. Once you have, and this was even before anybody even had a cloud in there, it was a twinkle in anyone's eye, was you had a website that maybe talked like the old 3-tier or N-tier. You had a
Mhm.
website, it talked to a business layer, it talked to a database. Once you add more than one person on the team, how do you all work on it together at the same time in a convenient way?
Yeah.
And even
Mm.
just make it 2 people. And now, I mean, I think a lot of us, and it'd be interesting what some of your thoughts are, whether you have them on YouTube, add them in the comments, or add them in the chat right now, is what do teams do to deal with that? Is they might have the development environment. So there's some SQL server set up on the network. You're allowed to access it. And that's where your app is going to talk to, and it's configured. So if we're talking .NET, your web config, because I'm sure that's what you were using back then, was
Mhm.
was talking to the business layer, and then the business layer was talking to the database. And so you would go like make a change to the business layer and you go deploy it. You would actually go deploy it onto that development environment so you could get back to working on the website. Or maybe you would deploy the website so that you could work on the business layer. Or maybe you didn't have a good way. So you were literally like coding and then just throwing the business layer out there and doing psychic debugging, because you can't run it all local in the debugger. Or if you were really brave like me, because I did this, is
Mhm.
you and so we're talking a while ago when this stuff was a little bit harder, the documentation wasn't as clear, was I figured out the remote debugger so that I could launch that business layer out on the development environment, remote debug into it, and then launch here and have them both kind of going.
And we're not talking that long ago. We're talking within the last 10 years, all of this.
I know.
Cloud distributed applications really started to come around. Maybe even, for some people close to 5 years. But the fact of, and this is where I think one of the things that Expire really helps with is that orchestration bit. All of those things, spinning those things up so that you could have your application run because it needed all those parts. That orchestration capability just makes that so seamless to be able to run, have that discovery, and then have it all work for you locally, which is great. And I think we explored that a few episodes ago. And what we're doing here is we're actually trying to take some of the component stuff and see, well, what does it look like to wire some of those in?
Yeah. I could be wrong, but I feel like the demos, and look, I think the demos are great. I think the videos that we're seeing out of Build, and I'm particularly excited to watch more completely because I've only seen a bit of it, the Brady Gaster video. Gosh, and I feel terrible because I know Brady's history so well that I'm not remembering now who the co-host was on that video. So I'm going to make sure I look that up while we're talking here.
It is Wendy.
Oh, thank you for remembering.
Well, only because you shared it with me, and I still have yet
Yeah.
to watch it, so it's in this list of things to do. But yeah, Wendy, and I'm not sure if it's breeding or briding, but Breiding.
No, I'm glad you remembered because, or at least, yes, you're right. And we'll have to get that link into the chat because the reality is that they both deserve credit. Absolutely. It's just that I think I've been watching Brady do things forever, so I remembered him distinctly. But certainly they both deserve full credit for a video that's about the tooling experience that I only got to start on, and I can't wait to finish it. But I feel like for me, that's the part of Aspire that is making your day-to-day developer life better. And that's something I don't know if I've been, I feel like it's something I've said on the show quite a bit, but it's really important to me as a teammate to try and make the experience better as part of I'm not just in there trying to make more features or add or squash bugs. It's, can we make this development and deployment experience just a little bit better every day? So I'm interested in this batch of components. Even if we don't get to them all today, I would love to come back to looking at other components, because I think what I was originally going to say is a lot of the demos tend to focus on a website, a web API, and then a database, and that might be SQL Server. I've seen some with Postgres, maybe a Redis cache. And now I'm thinking, but look at all these other components.
Yeah, because all of those you mentioned are things that are kind of already built-in components to Azure. Or I'm sorry, to Aspire, not to Azure. Some of them happen to be Azure, but not all of them. And I think that's coming at this from a .NET developer, you may not always be deploying your workloads into Azure. So that's why there are other components here, like Oracle Entity Framework Core sitting there.
Yeah.
Postgres Entity Framework,
Right.
which, although there's a Postgres in Azure, it is a little more NPG SQL agnostic, right? Just wherever it might be running with your connection string. So it's really cool, all the things that you can essentially start to wire up as things that your application might need, but as a building it locally for the first time and trying to get that F5 experience, these are things that there are hoops you've got to jump through sometimes to make all of those work. And this is a way to hopefully get past having to jump through all the hoops.
Right. So in the past 2 episodes, we have, in each case, first was with the Hello DallE app, and then second time we tried following one of the tutorial sets. And in both cases got stopped in the same spot where, I think I'm right about this, where we would run the distributed app. And I'm going to keep saying that, the distributed app, because now it is your set of applications and components all being fired up or connected to by the distributed app host, the distributed, that builder that we create in the .NET Aspire project, the .NET Aspire app host project. A lot of terminology here. So, the startup solution, a startup project here in Visual Studio, and you don't have to use Visual Studio to use .NET Aspire. If this is the first time you're hearing about .NET Aspire, we just happen to be in Visual Studio. Your
Yes.
startup project is the app host, which is a .NET Aspire distributed app, and that's all the code.
Mm-hmm.
It's really just kind of like connecting and firing up the pieces.
Yep.
The rest of your app stays the same. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's this project here. We went ahead and added that project just by doing the add Aspire method, or add Aspire orchestration, I think is what it's called. So that piece got added for us. And then there are some things we had to wire up. So this is the program file for that app host. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to comment this out and uncomment this, because this is what we were doing last time, in that we had, based on documentation, we were looking at and say, well, we can add Azure storage. And when you think about it, that's kind of what we're doing for our project, right? We're saying, hey, we've got a website, our original Hello DallE app, and that needs storage. It needs somewhere to store the pictures that get generated. That's the whole reason storage came about. So when we think about, or at least when I thought about builder.add storage, then that was what I was doing. And then the blob is just a connection to where that specific place where I'm deploying those images, as opposed to anything else, right? So I've added storage. My app needs storage. I add storage, and then I add a reference to what blob specifically I'm using, and then down here that gets included in the project.
Yep.
So that was kind of how I was thinking about it a little bit. But if we go through, and I think if I don't necessarily have to debug this, but if I go here and I say F12, we get into this line here, which essentially is adding Azure storage, sorry, but then that's going to call this method down here for adding storage, because I'm only giving it a name, and it's saying, well, I'll pass you along and we'll inject some stuff and we can look at those if that makes sense. But the important thing here is this add Azure provisioning. So it's actually, the way it runs, it looks like it's trying to go ahead and create the storage account for me. And part of the reason all that failed is we didn't give it any information about what storage account to create, essentially. Yep. So that was where things kind of hiccuped. And, if you go back into the documentation here, this one here, connect storage, which I think I just did. Yep. So, and this is what we started to run through last time, where as part of this, there are two ways you can do the storage part. One way is to use the portal, use the CLI, and use the developer CLI to go ahead and create those instances up in Azure. And that's the path that we went down, essentially. But we wound up getting the same error because we wound up having to put that same code into that project. But the other way to do it is to do an emulator, and that gives you essentially a way of having storage run locally in the back, locally on your machine, essentially. So it's just an option of how you want to set this up. You might have access, and I apologize for the background noise. The cat is scratching up on the post. I don't know if that's coming through.
No, I think just a little bit. Yeah.
Hang on one sec. The cat producer wants to get out. Hang on. That's what she's doing.
Yeah. No, but I mean, this was the key, was that we were trying to we were trying to understand. So for me, and again, a part of this is exploration.
Office with our animals.
Oh no, I know. Our executive producer is sitting next to me right now. But yeah, we're trying to understand, like, how do you use this? And for me, I come back to that whole team environment of,
right.
I think about the experience of, and we always use the brand new team member use case, which is a fine one, of brand new team member first day. Isn't it awesome when you work on a team and you tell them, oh yeah, you clone the repo, here's the link, you open your IDE with choice, you hit F5, and we're talking Visual Studio when I say that, and it runs. Like, that is fantastic.
Yes.
And so
that's what we strive for.
That's a wonderful place to be. And I feel like you see me willing to kind of beat my head against the wall a little bit to say, how do we get this app? How do we get our apps? How do we get Aspire to help us achieve that? And so part of my figuring was assume an environment where the storage configuration is going to be like you've been given a development storage environment, or maybe you have it's like, listen, your team is allowed to create storage accounts in this way, in this space. I don't know, a spending limit. I don't know. I just something.
Right.
And so go ahead and use that. You don't have to use the emulator. There's nothing wrong with the emulator. I think that's a great path. But the one thing that I'm wondering is we tried to follow this pretty directly. Do you think that there was a mention in here about how if you're using existing resources, then you have to go set that up somewhere?
Yes. So some of that, sorry. So some of that was, we did come across that, and you know, that's, hang on one sec. Part of the overview. No, it wasn't. It's funny. It wasn't in here. It was in. That's deployment. There we go. So this section here talks a little bit about some of the local Azure provisioning bit. And I think that's what you're getting at, right? So how do we do this if, you know, we want to use Azure because that's where things are going to go, but we need to understand, well, what needs to be put in, essentially be put in place. And this part here actually gets into some of the issues that we were running into when we think about the error when we just ran it in the configuration where it's just, hey, this is missing subscription configuration here. And that essentially it's trying to, it's missing our subscription ID essentially. So it doesn't have that in the app settings.json, which is where that should go. So that was, believe that was why we were getting that error that we were seeing essentially.
Right. And so I think, you know, and one of the things I would like to do is I would love to help update this. So
yeah, and I think what we might try and do is see if we can get it working.
Right.
You know,
if we figure out here's the steps you need, then maybe we can go to the tutorials and at the very least provide a link to say, hey, here's what you can do.
Yeah. So we could, because it's interesting. This provides a lot more information than, or different information than the Aspire component. So I just want to make sure we put this in the right spot. Need to provide configuration into the Azure section. So since that code runs, the code that we were looking at, the provisioning code runs inside of the app host and not your application. So it's almost like this should be wired up before it even gets to your, it should be wired up before it starts to call into the actual web app. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it does to me. And this is sort of, I think if I'm understanding correctly, this part of the documentation is telling you, here's how you kind of say where your Azure subscription is. So that way Azure components can go look up your subscription. They could go look up the resource group. They can go look up the location and provision the components that are needed. Or in the other case, I think the Azure provisioning, although we haven't really looked at the code in Azure provisioning, I feel like it is smart enough to say, okay, it's already there, so I don't have anything to do, and that's how you link up with an existing resource. So I think what you're saying is that we think adding this,
yep,
right,
to the secrets.
It can be in secrets. Like theoretically, according to that docs, the docs say it could be in app settings. Fine. But I feel like this is a secrets thing, right?
You should be protective of your this one here, your subscription ID.
Okay.
Right. That's the thing we usually have the Azure mask for that blocks that.
Right.
But there's no reason we couldn't fill those in. So this is let's TDTS Aspire demo, right? So all we're doing is we're giving, because when you think about it, whatever it is that we're going to create in Azure, we need to know two things. We need to know, three: the subscription, where we're going to create it; the resource group, because everything in Azure belongs in a resource group; and then finally the location, because we need to know where in the Azure cloud we're going to actually write this or create this resource. So if I can do that to say that's the name of our resource group, I can do East US 2 and say, well, that's where it's going to essentially locate that storage, and then I can go and copy a subscription ID into there. Now, when we do that, we should be able to go back to here, and this should run now if I'm following this correctly. So that's my plan. So why don't you take the camera off me?
Yeah, you still gotta add the subscription ID. So let's go ahead and do that.
Okay. Cool. This, paste that there.
Whoops, I'm talking and I think I hardware muted myself.
Oh.
But so I feel like it should have, it's one of those things where when I think about it now, I go like, oh yeah, it was only saying missing subscription information, right? Like,
yeah, but I also didn't see anything where it said to put it too when we were going through that tutorial.
I know, right? Yeah, you get in the tutorial mindset and you think like, well, I'm doing everything the tutorial says. So yeah. It's the kind of thing where I certainly would like to help out with that, which we'll see. If people are wondering here is that I'm double checking that we're getting coverage on Twitch, because for some reason I keep checking another monitor to make sure. So I'm not looking out for potential assailants behind me, if anybody's wondering.
All right, I think I got that cleaned up so it's in the right spot. So I'm going to come out of there, come into here, and if we can go back if you want.
Yep. There we go.
Yeah. Awesome. And I'll probably make that a little bigger. That should help.
So in the previous shows is where we set this up. So if you're coming in and you're saying, wait a second, you're just jumping to the end. Well, in part 1, we hooked up Hello DallE. And then in part 2, we said, okay, well, let's try hooking it up through the sample app. And in both places, we got to the same spot. So I am really curious.
Yeah. So from here, we'll just hit F5 or this debug start button, which is easy for you all to see out there.
And you're starting this. That's starting it in Kestrel, I think, which I'll admit has become my preferred way to work in Visual Studio. I'd love to know what people are doing. I still sometimes run across a colleague or somebody, and I look up in that little play button, and it's crazy how you can tell these things. But they're still using IIS Express, and I mean it's okay, it works. But oh, look at that! Hold on, what?
It's starting.
That'll be, I mean, honestly, I'm going to be so both blown away and sad that it was just the one thing. And it makes me wonder, the resource group and location you put in, are those the resources you did provision?
Those are new.
Okay, so it's out there saying, in fact, I think it even is saying it's compiling ARM.
Yeah.
And perhaps building a new solution, a new storage location for you.
Yeah, where did that go? There it is. So yeah, there we go. It's waiting for deployment. That's the endpoint. So I can actually click that and go into the actual storage account in the portal.
Look at this.
Actually, this is the deployment. So this is what it's doing. So you can look at all the inputs. You can look at the outputs when it's done. But in the end, we'll get a link to our storage account. Yeah. It's interesting. It's got 2. Well, no, it was the same one. All right. So then we can go to the resource group, which should be named TDTS Aspire Demo, which it is, right? That's what we gave it. And then we've got our breakpoint here because I had that on the website just to kind of see what's going on. So this is when it actually adds that client from the Aspire piece.
Right.
Now.
Right. Because in your app, you were creating an Azure Blob client, and now Aspire is adding it to a dependency injection for you.
Yes.
Yeah.
So go back to. Oh, we're in that same one here. So this is So this is the Aspire telemetry dashboard. So we can see we've got all of our components running where we've got our blob storage resource, our storage resource, right? Because storage in Azure can do 4 different things: blobs, files, queues, and tables. Specifically, we're having it do blobs at this point. There's no specific. It did not. There is a specific endpoint, but it didn't bring it into here for that because that's not, I think, how we're using it. Interesting. We'll have to. I'm curious how it is connecting to that then. That's interesting. Okay.
What happens if you run the app now? Yeah.
Yeah. So this is the Hello DallE app. And just as a quick reminder, none of this is coming from a database or any kind of a data store. We are going out to Azure OpenAI service and saying, I need some questions that I can ask a user to determine how to define a picture, essentially, or how to define an image. And if we go and what it does, it gives us that back in a JSON template, in a JSON format, which is what this is here. And so my code's able to essentially ingest that and create the questions. So we could say, let's do blue, let's do a background gradient, let's do something patterned, buildings, and whimsical. And then from that, generate a prompt that we will then pass on to the DallE service and have it go ahead and generate an image for us. So the cool thing about this is all of this is happening. So you think about how we might be interacting with generative AI now. A lot of that is, it's a chat where I ask it a question and it gives me a response, or I have a little bit of an interactive conversation with it. We're still using generative AI, but I'm passing the prompts as part of my application. So the user doesn't have to type all of that out. It's just interact with my app just with the mouse clicks. And I end up getting this image here. Now, this image should be stored in blob storage in Azure. So if we go to that resource, we look at storage browser, we look at blobs, and look, we have our DallE images get created because the code will look to see if it exists. And if not, wherever I'm attached storage-wise, to go ahead and create that, container, essentially, for me. And then from there, I have this image. And in addition to the image, I'm including the metadata, right? So there's the questions, those are the answers. Here's the prompt that we use to create the image. So if I wanted to, you can't go back and recreate the image, but I can at least see the metadata and the information that was used at the application time to create that image, essentially. Because even if we were to put this, create a whimsical, whatever, it's going to give us a different image because that's the way generative AI works.
And so for people watching, this is a blob in Azure storage. It happens to be an image, but a blob can literally be anything.
Yes, exactly. Okay. It could be a PDF, it could be a doc, could be, any kind of a Office file. It's just some location to store content.
Right. So good uses for metadata and tags. I noticed that those 2 categories were there. Mm-hmm. Metadata, you basically wanted to say, hey, it's not the image itself, but at least later I can link up what did I use to create the image. And again, that seems fully customizable. You created key value, whatever you want it to be.
Yeah. And if you want, we can show where that is in the code.
Right. And the difference between that and a blob index tag, while you're looking here, or
image generation. Yeah. So here's all along as we were going through and getting the answers to the questions, we were saving them in this metadata state object, so that when we actually go ahead and upload our image, while we're uploading the image, we also say, we'll go ahead and include that metadata that we've collected all along. So when the questions get created, we add to the metadata state. When the prompt gets created, so we're doing those all along those steps. And I'm sorry, you had a question about what was over in Azure.
Well, so I kind of know, but I'm just wondering.
Yeah.
I'm not trying to put you on the spot. Is so blob index tags. That seems
Hmm.
like a different thing than metadata, and I'm guessing that perhaps you can query by blob index tags.
Yes, I would think you can.
Okay. I mean, it's just
I
it's interesting to show that like even though I've never really thought deeply about some of the storage stuff that I've used,
Yeah.
and I'm kind of thinking about it now, thinking like, huh,
Here we
would
go.
it? I yeah, go ahead.
So it's just essentially key value pairs
Yeah, right.
that can be used, and there's a much more and I would have to find the link to it, but essentially there is reasons why you would use one over the other. Essentially, I'm just blanking on what that reason is right now. But yeah, so essentially it's just key value attributes that you can put on the actual image or files that you put up into that Azure space. So if we wanted to, we could say, hey, this is, you know, or sorry, more like something like that. So we can classify all the images that come through here with that general tag, as opposed to the actual metadata that talks about talks about the document content itself. So if I wanted to say, well, as you were testing this out, show me all the images that came through development, as opposed to images that might get pushed in blob storage because they were pushed in there from uh, this running up in an Azure instance somewhere, right? We'd have a different key value pair on that.
So now let's do something else, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
Let's
Yeah, let's do it.
stop the app and restart it
Okay.
because I want to see this time. And this is just what I'm looking. Maybe this is totally obvious. Is I feel like, well, it's not going to provision anything. I think it'll just say, "Oh, resources are there. Let's get moving."
It shouldn't, right? It doesn't mean it. Let me do that. It
Well, we're
doesn't mean it
seeing how it
won't
works.
try. Yeah. Oh, wow.
Yeah, just boom. That's it. Done.
It's running. Yeah.
Okay. So I will tell you, this I'm happy about this, and here's what I feel, and I would love to hear what people think. Is here's what I think this leads towards. I know it seems like a small demo, right? But how many
Mhm.
times do I can think of apps that I work on right now or in the past that that inevitably there's some resource, and this doesn't have to be an Azure resource, it doesn't have to be
Mhm.
a resource on another cloud, it doesn't have to be SQL Server or Postgres, whatever, but it's some resource that your app connects to, and so you inevitably don't have it on your machine,
Right.
and so you go ahead and you put a connection string in somewhere, and worse, it gets committed to version control. We've gone over that on this show over and over and over.
Mhm.
So use secrets, but that only partially solves the problem. Using secrets is great. Like I love it. But now the problem is, am I going to share that resource with you on my team? Are we going to have our own? And I feel like what I'm seeing is pathways to all of that.
Sure.
Have your own, use a shared one. Doesn't matter because Aspire will connect it up. And now, as inevitably your app moves through environments, because I think people will agree that many organizations will have environments, the development environment, they might call another environment QA, they might call it pre-prod, staging. Like we can come up with all kinds of names,
Yeah.
but it's different connection strings. And so now immediately the problem is, well, what do we do? How do we get the strings for QA right? And how do we get them right for prod? And that's like a whole show and talking about how you should properly do that. But what Aspire's letting me do is say, I don't have to make changes to the app. I
Mhm.
especially don't have to do what happens so often is, hold on, I've just brought the code down. Now let me go change a file and then hope that I don't commit that back in and mess it up for the rest of my team.
Yes, absolutely. Now, I can poke around a little bit off camera, but somewhere that value of the endpoint to my storage environment is in my code, right? I think when we did the one last session, it was name of my storage dot blobs dot core dot windows dot net.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
That value with essentially with the and they gave it an interesting name here. Resource groups. Oh, there it is. Sorry. Right. So it's storage MB3, you know, with some kind of a unique string of characters at the end of it, because it's got to be unique across that windows.net domain space. Somewhere this reference exists inside of my code. My guess is it got written to the app settings. And maybe I will stop sharing for a second and pull that up just to see.
Yeah. So no, I like how that was, and I almost feel kind of bad that it's a separate video, but like we got all the way to the end, and then now we know that you'll be able to run this. And yes, in your case, you've got to provision. Well, not provision. You have to basically link up the resources you want to use. But I have been thinking about. I've also been thinking about like, okay, is it easy to switch from one to the emulator? It might be. It might be all settings based.
Right.
Because there is a command. I don't want to say command. There was an extension method or a method or something as part of the builder process where you say run in the emulator.
Mm-hmm.
And I suppose that a team could either wire that up per environment. In fact, I believe in the tutorial they say, well, if your ASP.NET Core environment variable is development, then we're going to assume you want to run in the emulator, which I think is good.
Right.
But if your team has a different approach, you could still make that work by going and looking at a setting and saying like, oh, I'm supposed to run it in the emulator instead.
Yeah, and there is with emulator. So much like you have with resources, there's with emulator option in the that you could have in the code for the app host, and you could have that triggered off of some kind of a configuration variable essentially when it runs. That is something that is kind of buried in the docs, and they're working on pulling that up. But that would be so that Aspire or Azure Write demo, which is an emulator essentially for Azure storage, that would be how you would bring that in. You would say with run emulator and then pointing it to where it goes. So you can see my screen because you're at least a little bit because it's in the preview mode.
Right.
But essentially there's a section that got written to the secrets file. That's an Azure section. It has the tenant name and then the deployments. In this case, it's just storage because that's what we called it. And then it's got an idea of where that lives, the parameters that are needed for that to make that connection. There's an outputs property as well as a checksum property to make sure that none of those things change on us. So
now, who wrote that? Not you.
The code wrote that. Yeah. So
Aspire wrote it straight to secrets.
Yes.
Oh, wow. That's interesting.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That's just interesting to me how to think about how this all works under the hood, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And speaking of how this works under the hood, and I'm going to close this secrets file up real quick. The one thing to consider is, we'll come back to me here. One.
Oh, it's just fighting us.
There we go.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay. So when it talks to Azure, how does it know who it's communicating as? And essentially, if you look at your account settings here inside of Visual Studio, you have all of your accounts here. And I have my Azure account that I'm signed in with. That's how it's making the connection up into my Azure environment. So that's the account it's going to use. So if you could probably put another account in there if you because what happens is, and this happens a lot with customers when we talk to them about, well, I don't have the rights to build stuff in Azure or to even in my development environment. Everything's got to go through the DevOps process and creating some kind of a Terraform or ARM or Bicep template to instantiate those things. So I can't just do this on the fly. So you might have to work a little bit with your team and be able to say, well, since I can't do this on my own, then my app host would be doing something like what we did in line 8. So control copy, where I just get a connection string from the team that created that component for me in Azure. I include that inside of my app in the secrets file, and I just basically go ahead and run that way, as opposed to going down the path of adding the Azure storage part. So just depends how your development team works and what kind of access you have into that environment there.
Yeah. No, I'm this is intriguing now. And now what I like is, so we took an existing project. Now it's really got me going, thinking about a new project where we kind of use this to have it distributed and from the get-go, like we're thinking distributed app from the beginning.
Yep.
And then think about, like, do we want this, how do we want this to help us? And I don't want this to take, I'm not trying to make this take the place of a deployment pipeline,
Which
so right, it's not supposed to. It's just for day-to-day development. It's so that as a developer, I feel like I have everything I need to just go to work, but it doesn't take the place of a deployment pipeline. So that's a key thing to think through. And also there's videos on it, right? And so I'll admit, I admit that need to get back to kind of the build watching, but it's been busy. So no, I'm glad that it was that simple. I'm glad, because for a while I was a little thinking like, man, what are we missing? But to your point, you could just directly add the connection string and boom, or we can say, hey, add Azure storage, and then you take care of the provisioning. So
yeah. And when it comes down to it, with the add connection string is really what we had back in here, right? We kind of grabbed that out of the user strings here. But yeah, so it just depends on where you're starting from, and then what kind of capabilities you have to kind of include as much of the Aspire features as you have. So yeah, I kind of wanted to make sure we got through showing that we made this work, and might be if you have questions, you see the video, that let's drop the comments and let us know what you think.
Yeah, definitely let us know what you think. And yes, definitely for the rest of it, we have 2 parts. Part 1 worked on this app, part 2 worked on the tutorial, got to the same exact spot. So now hopefully everybody can see that it's about provisioning the resources, and whether they're provisioned, not provisioned, and so on. So
yeah.
So unfortunately, I have a little bit of an early meeting, and it seems like our executive producer is upset about something. But I think that'll do a little bit of a quick show. But
kind of put closure on it.
Yeah, hopefully it works for everybody. And lots of things coming up, right? Like .NET 9 is coming. Getting back to the Blazor authentication story, that is coming. And and then I think some new projects that, especially involving OpenAI.
Yeah, which I might try and work on while you're. Well, I know you've got some busy time coming up, and it might be tough to do a show, so I might start that this week.
Okay, no, that would be great. That would be great. I think it's going to be really exciting. I'm excited to see how it'll work. I know we haven't discussed it on the show yet, so maybe I'll let you do that another time, about what we're thinking about doing specifically for the channel using AI. I'm excited. So.
Yes. Same. Sorry. Lost audio.
All right. So,
all right. Cool.
My doorbell rang.
So with that, I think we'll put a wrap on the show. Yeah. I'm going to wrap us out of here. Chris, we'll talk soon. And for everybody else out there, thanks for watching Dev Talk Show, and we'll see you next time.